Dim the lights. Let the noise of the present fade. Imagine the mountains of Persia in the 11th century, their jagged peaks rising like black teeth against the starless sky. Somewhere in those heights, a fortress clings to the stone like a shadow made solid. Its name is whispered with dread, Alamut. Inside, torches sputter along narrow corridors. Silent figures move like ghosts, their blades hidden, their faith sharper still. In the world beyond these walls, kings sleep uneasily, and viziers glance over their shoulders, for death walks in daylight now, cloaked not in armies but in conviction. And at the heart of it all, an austere man with burning eyes, a man who believes he can reshape the world with daggers and devotion. Picture yourself in the press of a crowded bazaar. The air reeks of spice and sweat. Somewhere in that throng is a single assassin, hand steady, heart serene. You don't see him until it's too late. That is the terror. That is the legend. This is the story of the assassins. The story does not begin in blood, though it will end there many times over. It begins in silence. Persia, 11th century, a land where mountains rise like walls and valleys cradle villages that seem too fragile to survive the storms of empire. Here, beneath the shadow of great powers, a faith was being tested, reshaped, and sharpened into something that would cut the world. The Seljuks ruled these lands, Turkic horsemen turned sultans, their banners rippling in the desert wind, their courts filled with viziers and poets, soldiers and spies. They were conquerors but also guardians of a brittle order, an empire that stretched wide but shook with tension. Beneath their boots, beneath the prayers sung in the Friday mosques, the earth was restless. For within Islam, voices quarreled over rightful succession, over truth and authority, over who held the keys to paradise. And in that storm of belief was born Hasan ibn Sabbah. Picture him not yet the legend, not yet the old man of the mountain, but a boy in Qom or perhaps Ray, both cities humming with scholars and merchants. His family was Persian, Shiraz, in a world ruled by Sunni orthodoxy. From childhood, Hasan would have felt the weight of being marked as other, his faith a minority, his devotion questioned. Imagine the young boy walking through narrow streets lined with brick walls, hearing sermons that dismissed his creed as heresy, feeling the sting of isolation. Such things leave scars. Such things forge conviction. Hasan was brilliant. That much everyone agrees. His mind was precise, hungry, and unyielding. He devoured the teachings of scholars like a man parched in a desert drinks water. He argued, debated, challenged. By the time he was a young man, he had found his way to the Ismaili branch of Sharia Islam, radical, esoteric, devoted to a hidden imam whose very concealment gave followers both mystery and hope. The Ismailis were dreamers of a kind. They believed in a truth behind truth, a meaning hidden in scripture that only the initiated could see. To study with them was not just to memorize prayers but to peel back the skin of the world and glimpse the marrow of divine reality. For Hasan, this was more than intoxicating, it was destiny. Now imagine him in Cairo, the beating heart of the Fatimid Caliphate, that glittering rival to Baghdad, a city of palaces, markets, and learning. The Fatimid caliphs claimed descent from Fatima, daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. They ruled as both monarchs and imams, combining political power with divine legitimacy. To walk through Cairo was to feel the hum of a civilization at its peak. Libraries filled with scrolls, scholars in heated debate, astronomers charting the heavens. It was here, in the Dar al-Hikmah, the house of knowledge, that Hasan ibn Sabbah honed himself. Picture him sitting cross-legged on carpets, listening as teachers explained the hierarchies of creation, the mysteries of revelation. He absorbed it all, eyes burning, his mind turning sharper with each lesson. But Hasan was not just a student. He was a strategist in the making. He looked around at the Fatimids and saw not just their glory but their vulnerability, the cracks within their empire, the rivalries that would soon tear them apart. Here the legend becomes tangled with rumor. Some say Hasan quarreled with viziers, others that he saw treachery and fled. Some claim he was betrayed by court rivals who envied his mind. Whatever the truth, Hasan left Cairo under a shadow. He had seen too much to remain. He returned east with a vision already crystallizing inside him. If empires crumbled under the weight of armies, perhaps there was another way to fight. Travel with him now through Persia once more. The Seljuks dominate, their sultans strong, their viziers cunning. Among them towers Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier, a man whose pen and mind shaped the empire, whose policies hold together a fragile realm. To the Ismailis, he was an enemy, the embodiment of Sunni power. To Hasan, he would become the first great adversary. But Hasan was not yet ready to strike. He needed a base. He needed more than faith. He needed stone walls, a sanctuary carved into the very bones of the mountains. And so his eyes fell upon Alamut. The fortress sat like a hawk's nest above a narrow valley, its name itself meaning eagle's teaching, or nest of pain, depending on how you translate the old tongue. To reach it was to climb into the clouds, up paths so narrow a single man could defend them against an army. Alamut was not the grandest of fortresses, but it was perfect. Isolated, defensible, near fertile lands yet hidden from the gaze of the great powers. Legend says Hasan took it by trickery rather than force. He is said to have infiltrated the valley, sent his men disguised as farmers, stonecutters, laborers. Slowly they filled the village below, quietly loyal, invisible in plain sight. Then, when the time was right, Hasan revealed his hand. Some stories claim he offered the fortress's owner 3,000 dinars for its purchase, a symbolic price, paid in a bargain sealed more by inevitability than by coin. Others whisper he seized it by guile, his followers already inside, their daggers flashing in the dark. However it happened, Alamut was his. Pause and imagine that moment, the gates closing, the banners raised, the mountain fortress now claimed for a new cause. Inside, Hasan began to build not just walls but a brotherhood. He did not gather armies. He gathered disciples. Young men who hungered for meaning, who were willing to sacrifice everything for faith. To them he taught not only theology but discipline. Alamut was part school, part monastery, part armory. Here lives were reshaped. Here the assassins were born. And what did they believe? That the world was corrupt, that rulers served only their own power, that truth had been buried beneath tyranny. They believed the Imam, hidden from the world, would one day return to bring justice. And until that day, they would serve as his dagger, his shadow, his whisper of judgment. Picture the training. Long hours in stone courtyards, young men practicing silence, patience, obedience. Their weapons were small, daggers, nothing more, but wielded with precision, they could unmake empires. Hasan forbade drunkenness, forbade indulgence. His disciples fasted, prayed, and learned to live with death. When their moment came, they would walk into crowds unafraid, knowing their lives were already given. This was the beginning. From the narrow valleys of Persia, the rumor began to spread. Men who feared nothing, who struck leaders in daylight, who melted back into the crowd or accepted death with serene smiles. The world did not yet know their name, but soon it would. And so the story deepens. You and I, standing at the foot of the Alamut cliffs, can almost hear the echo of steel on stone, the whispered prayers of young men who would one day make kings tremble. The assassins had risen from the shadows of faith and exile, born in the mind of Hasan ibn Sabbah, now taking root in a fortress above the clouds. The world below bustled with armies and merchants, but above, in the nest of eagles, something darker was stirring, a brotherhood that would fight not with numbers, but with fear. The night winds sweep across the peaks, carrying the faint clang of hammers striking steel, the murmur of voices in the courtyard. A fire burns within Alamut, steady, unyielding. From here the assassins will descend into history, unseen yet unforgettable. And as you step with me deeper into their world, you realize, we are only at the beginning. No myth proved more enduring than that of the garden. Travelers whispered that hidden within the fortress was a secret paradise, an enclosed valley blooming with orchards, streams of milk and wine, and maidens of incomparable beauty. To the crusaders who heard these tales, it seemed the assassins had found a way to steal heaven itself, to offer glimpses of paradise on earth as a reward for obedience. Chroniclers in Europe wrote of Hasan ibn Sabbah drugging his young disciples with hashish, carrying them half-conscious into these gardens, and awakening them in splendor. Surrounded by women and pleasures beyond imagining, the novices believed themselves transported into paradise. Then, when the drug wore off and they awoke again in the bare stone chambers of Alamut, Hasan would whisper, "Obey me, and you will return to that eternal garden when you die." From such stories came the name, Hashishiyah, twisted in the mouths of enemies into the word that would echo through centuries, assassin. But here lies the truth. No evidence proves that such gardens ever existed at Alamut. The tales grew not from eyewitnesses but from fear. To the crusaders, the idea that men could walk calmly to their deaths was incomprehensible. They needed an explanation, and what better than sorcery, drugs, and deception? To them, the assassins could not be motivated by faith. Surely it must be trickery. Surely no man in his right mind would smile at death without promise of reward. And so the myth of the garden spread, embroidered with each retelling, until it became inseparable from the very name of Alamut. There were other legends too, darker, more intimate. Some said Hasan ibn Sabbah never laughed, never showed joy, that his face was as unyielding as the cliffs around him. Others swore that he ruled by sorcery, that he could command visions and strike men down with curses. Even his austerity fed the myths. The story of him executing his own son for drinking wine traveled swiftly, proof that his justice was merciless, even toward blood. Among neighboring villagers, the assassins became half men, half phantoms. It was said they could appear in a crowd like smoke, strike, and vanish without a trace. Peasants in Persia told their children not to wander near the mountains, lest the old man's disciples take them away. To speak too loudly of Alamut was to invite doom. Better to whisper, better to avert one's gaze when its towers appeared on the horizon. And when the Crusaders arrived in the Levant, they carried these stories back to Europe. Chroniclers filled their parchments with tales of men who feared nothing, who obeyed their master with supernatural loyalty. Marco Polo, centuries later, would repeat the garden story as though it were gospel, cementing the myth for audiences who would never see Persia with their own eyes. The irony, of course, is that the truth was stranger than the legend. For Hasan did not need gardens of illusion to bind his followers. He needed only conviction, discipline, and the fire of belief. The assassin's fearlessness was not born from intoxication, but from devotion. They embraced death because they believed it opened the door to truth. That made them far more terrifying than any drugged vision of paradise. Still, the myths served a purpose. They magnified the aura of Alamut, turning the fortress into a symbol that stretched far beyond its walls. If enemies thought the assassins were sorcerers, if rulers feared their daggers were guided by unseen powers, so much the better. Fear was as much a weapon as the blade itself, and rumor was its sharpest edge. Stand with me once more on the high walls of Alamut. The valley below lies silent, unaware that its narrow fields have become the center of legend. In the distance, armies clash, banners fall, rulers rise and die. But here, in this nest above the clouds, stories are being forged as surely as daggers. Stories of gardens, of sorcery, of men who laugh at death. And though stone may crumble, stories endure. It is here, in this mingling of truth and myth, discipline and legend, that we begin to see Alamut not only as fortress but as symbol. To the faithful, it was proof that God's truth could be defended against the might of empires. To their enemies, it was a nightmare perched in the mountains, a place where shadows became men and men became shadows. From this duality we step forward, toward the next truth of the assassins, that their greatest weapon was not the blade at all, but belief itself. Faith, sharpened into steel, carried from the stone chambers of Alamut into the hearts of kings and sultans. And so, with the myths still swirling in the air, let us walk deeper into their world, into the doctrine that made men unafraid of death, and into the fire that turned faith itself into shield and sword. The fortress still lingers in your thoughts, doesn't it? Even as we descend from its walls, the image clings, stone carved into sky, a nest of daggers disguised as prayers. But to understand why those stones endured, and why the assassins became more than mountain rebels, you must see what burned within them. Faith. It was the marrow of Alamut. The blade was nothing without it, just steel glinting in the sun. What made that steel dreadful was belief. Belief that was as sharp, as unbending, as unforgiving as the mountain itself. Hasan ibn Sabbah built his order not on promises of wealth or spoils, for he offered none. His disciples did not march for plunder. They carried no banners, no chest of gold to tempt them. What he gave them was harder, fiercer, certainty. Certainty that their lives, their deaths, every breath between, were threads woven into a divine tapestry. The Nizari Creed told them that the visible world was only surface, a skin stretched thin over hidden truth. Beneath the words of Scripture lay layers upon layers of meaning, veiled from the masses but revealed to the initiated. To the faithful of Hasan, they were not merely reading verses. They were unlocking secret doors. They saw themselves as keepers of knowledge the world had rejected, guardians of a truth preserved through persecution, exile, and blood. That conviction made them unyielding. Picture a young disciple in Alamut's courtyard, dagger in hand, eyes closed in prayer. He is not rehearsing murder. He is rehearsing sacrifice. He knows, not hopes, not imagines, but knows, that his death will not be an end but a passage. To fall with a blade in service of the Imam was not tragedy, it was triumph. His blood would be ink upon the page of history, writing the story of a faith no empire could silence. This was why they could walk into a crowd and strike in daylight. Why they could wait for years in silence, serving unnoticed in kitchens, bazaars, even courts, until the hour came. Why they could accept torture without betrayal, execution without plea. Death had lost its teeth for them. Their faith had broken it. To outsiders, this devotion was bewildering. Seljuk viziers, crusader knights, Christian chroniclers, all searched for explanations. Drugs, sorcery, illusions of paradise. They could not believe men could be bound by conviction alone. And yet within Alamut's walls, that was the iron law, faith sharpened into obedience, belief tempered into courage. But faith was not only weapon. It was shield. It guarded the Nizaris in a world that despised them. Sunni jurists condemned them as heretics, Seljuk rulers hunted them, rival sects scorned them. To be a Nizari was to walk marked, forever at the edge of survival. But within the doctrine, they found armor. If the world rejected them, it was only proof that the world was blind. If kings called them traitors, it was because kings feared the truth they carried. If armies burned their villages, then every martyr's death was fuel for the fire of belief. Alamut itself was a fortress of stone, yes, but more than that it was a fortress of meaning. Each prayer said within its walls was a stone laid against despair. Each disciple trained was another wall against annihilation. Even when the Seljuks marched with thousands, the assassins held fast, because they believed the mountain itself was less enduring than their cause. Faith became performance too, wielded deliberately. When an assassin struck in daylight and waited calmly for capture, it was not only an act of murder. It was liturgy. A public sermon delivered in silence. We do not fear. We are beyond your reach. Your power ends at the skin. Ours begins in the soul. Such acts were not random violence but theater of belief, a theater designed to terrify rulers and to inspire the faithful scattered in valleys and villages. And so, As the myths of gardens and sorcery spread, the truth was stranger still. These were not illusions of paradise, but men already convinced they walked its threshold. They needed no intoxication, no false visions. Their shield was faith itself, and their weapon was the certainty that death could never touch what they served. Listen closely, for in this lies the heart of the assassin's endurance. Empires rise on armies, on gold, on the loyalty of men who can be bribed or broken. But the assassins rose on conviction. You cannot bribe faith. You cannot threaten men who welcome death. And that is why kings trembled, why viziers looked over their shoulders, why crusaders carried home tales of terror. They were not fighting men. They were fighting meaning. And meaning is harder to kill than armies. The torches of Alamut burn low as we leave its walls behind us, but their light does not fade. It clings, it follows, it illuminates the path ahead. For faith, that fierce, unyielding flame, will shape every dagger drawn, every ruler struck, every whisper that spreads the name of the assassins across empires. And now, having felt the stone beneath our feet and the fire within their souls, we walk forward into the figure at the center of it all, the man whose will sharpen both faith and blade, the one they called the Old Man of the Mountain, Hasan ibn Sabbah. Faith may have been the fire of Alamut, but every flame needs a hearth. And in that fortress, the hearth was a man, Hasan ibn Sabbah. You must imagine him not as legend first, but as he lived. He was not a general astride a horse, not a king wrapped in silks, not even a preacher adored by crowds. He was austere, severe, lean. Chroniclers speak of him as tall, gaunt, his face rarely marked by a smile. He dressed plainly, ate sparingly, spoke without flourish. And yet, in that very spareness lay his power. He was a man who had stripped himself of all excess, leaving only iron will. His followers called him Sayyidna, our master. His enemies named him Sheikh al-Jabal, the Old Man of the Mountain. From those mountains, his shadow stretched across empires. But who was he truly? Born in Persia, in a Shureh household under Sunni rule, Hasan learned early the art of being an outsider. In the city of Ray, he walked streets where sermons often condemned his faith, where whispers marked him as other. Such experiences sharpened him, but they did not break him. He was gifted with a restless mind, drawn to study. Theology, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, Hasan devoured them all. His memory was said to be prodigious, his arguments razor-edged. It was in Cairo, in the splendor of the Fatimid Caliphate, that his destiny crystallized. There, amidst the grandeur of the House of Knowledge, he encountered the Ismaili mission in full. He studied their hidden doctrines, their vision of a world guided by the Imam, a figure both political and divine. Yet Cairo was also a city of intrigue. Viziers plotted, rivals clashed, succession disputes turned bloody. Hasan's brilliance drew attention, and perhaps envy. Some claim he fell afoul of powerful ministers, others that he saw treachery in the court. Whatever the reason, Hasan departed Cairo, carrying with him not disillusionment, but purpose. He would take what he had learned and plant it in Persian soil. Returning to his homeland, Hasan began to preach the Nizari cause. He moved with cunning, traveling through villages and towns, speaking quietly, gathering converts. His words struck like flint, simple, sharp, igniting conviction in those who felt forgotten by empires. Yet Hasan knew words alone were fragile. They could be silenced by swords. He needed stone. He needed a fortress. And so came Alamut. His taking of it, whether by trickery, persuasion, or coin, was the act that transformed him from preacher to master. From that moment, he was no longer merely a man with ideas. He was a ruler. But what kind of ruler? Not one of indulgence. While kings around him built palaces, Hasan built discipline. His fortress was not a court but a monastery, and he its abbot. He demanded austerity from his followers, and lived it himself. Wine was forbidden. laughter rare. Betrayal met with death, no matter how close the bloodline. The story of his son is infamous. Accused of breaking the law of abstinence, he was executed by his father's order. To Hasan, even kinship bowed before principle. This severity inspired awe and fear alike. To his disciples, it proved his absolute devotion. If he could condemn his own blood for disobedience, then surely no one else would be spared. To his enemies, it painted him as merciless, a fanatic unmoved by the softer bonds of humanity. But both friends and foes agreed on one thing: Hasan's word was law. His authority was not loud, but absolute. He ruled through silence as much as speech. When he gave a command, it was carried out not because of fear of punishment, but because of belief in his vision. He embodied the creed so fully that to disobey him was to disobey God's truth. That was his genius. He became more than leader, he became symbol. And symbols endure. Consider how his enemies saw him. The Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, the great architect of the Seljuk state, feared Hasan's growing influence. Rumor has it the two men once knew each other, even studied together, before destiny set them on opposing paths. Whether truth or legend, the image lingers: two brilliant minds, once in debate, now locked in a war of daggers and decrees. When Nizam al-Mulk fell to an assassin's blade in 1092, many saw it as Hasan's declaration to the world: the order had begun. The old man's hand could reach into the very heart of empire. And yet, Hasan himself rarely left Alamut. Unlike kings who toured their domains or generals who led from horseback, Hasan stayed within his mountain fortress. He ruled not by presence in courts, but by absence, by the knowledge that his eyes and ears stretched far beyond the valley, carried by disciples whose loyalty was unbreakable. He became a figure of paradox, unseen yet everywhere, silent yet feared. It was in this paradox that myth grew. To crusaders who heard tales of him, Hasan became half phantom, half sorcerer. They imagined him enthroned among gardens of paradise, pulling the strings of fearless killers with whispered promises. Chroniclers painted him as a spider at the center of a web, tugging at threads that made kings and lords tremble. Whether exaggerated or not, the effect was real. His name alone became a weapon. But to the Nazaris, Hasan was not a sorcerer. He was a guardian, a proof that their faith could stand against the might of empires. He gave them more than safety, he gave them identity. In a world that called them heretics, Hasan gave them dignity. In a world that tried to erase them, he carved a sanctuary in stone. Picture him at evening, standing on the high balcony of Alamut. The wind tears at his cloak, the valley spreads in shadow below. He does not smile, does not soften. His gaze is fixed beyond the mountains, toward empires that would see him destroyed. But within the fortress, behind him, his disciples kneel in prayer, their voices steady. He has given them more than walls, he has given them certainty. And in return, they have given him their lives. Thus was Hasan ibn Sabbah, austere, relentless, unwavering. A man who turned faith into blade, discipline into empire, myth into immortality. Kings and sultans would die, crusaders would come and go, Mongols would sweep across the land. But the old man of the mountain would endure in memory, as both terror and symbol, long after his bones turned to dust. And from his silence, from his iron will, the tactics of the Brotherhood would emerge, tactics that made armies irrelevant, that made daggers more powerful than battalions. From Hasan's hand, a new kind of warfare was born, the tactics of terror. Terror is not always loud. Sometimes it is silence sharpened into steel. The assassins did not march in ranks, did not clash with cavalry or thunder across fields and banners of war. They were patient. They were precise. They understood something empires often forget. You do not always need to fight an army. Sometimes you only need to frighten one man, if that man is the right one. Hasan ibn Sabbah shaped this doctrine like a blade. He looked at the Seljuk Empire, vast and powerful, and saw not strength but weakness. Armies were costly, fortresses cumbersome, rulers dependent on a chain of loyal men. Cut one link, and the chain broke. Strike at the head, and the body stumbles. And so he taught his disciples, the enemy is not the soldier in the field. The enemy is the vizier, the emir, the commander. Kill one, and 10,000 soldiers are suddenly masterless. This was the essence of the tactics of terror, not war, but surgery. Picture it, a crowded mosque in Isfahan, the vizier Nizam al-Mulk kneeling in prayer. Around him, guards stand watchful, courtiers murmur, the faithful bow in unison. It seems safe. Yet from within that sea of worshippers, a single young man steps forward. No armor, no banner, no trumpet of war. Only a dagger held steady by conviction. In an instant the vizier, the architect of Seljuk power, the man who held the empire together, lies bleeding on the mosque floor. Panic erupts, the crowd surges, the guard seize the killer. But the blow is struck. The empire staggers. This was not random murder. It was theater. Every assassination was a performance, staged to send ripples of fear. The killers did not strike in shadows. They struck in daylight, in public, in the places rulers thought themselves safest, the court, the feast, the mosque. They wanted witnesses. They wanted the message clear: no wall, no guard, no ritual could protect you. And always the aftermath was the same. The killer did not flee. He did not hide. He stood calm, serene, sometimes even smiling, waiting for the mob to tear him apart. Because his survival was not the point. The act was the point. To die in the strike was victory, for it proved what every ruler feared, that the assassins could not be deterred. This patience, this precision, was their genius. Armies terrified populations. The assassins terrified kings. Armies demanded treasure and endless supplies. The assassins needed only a dagger and a man who did not fear death. Armies occupied land. The assassins occupied minds. And fear spreads faster than soldiers. Soon, the very whisper of their presence was enough. An emir accused of corruption, a crusader lord planning conquest, a Seljuk governor taxing his peasants too harshly, all glanced over their shoulders, wondering if the boy serving their wine was more than he seemed. The terror was not only in the killings, but in the uncertainty. Anyone, anywhere, could be assassin. That doubt hollowed out confidence, corroded power. Sometimes the blade was not even necessary. There are stories, whether true or embellished, who can say, of rulers who awoke in their chambers to find a dagger placed upon their pillow, or a note pinned to their bedpost, "You are within our reach." Imagine the cold sweat of such a moment, the realization that the enemy had slipped into the heart of your fortress, past your guards, past your locked doors, and then slipped away again like smoke. Such gestures bent rulers to Hasan's will without a single life lost. But when the blade did fall, it was unforgettable. The assassins trained not for battlefields but for patience. A disciple might live for years in disguise, serving in a court, laboring as a scribe, tending as a servant, all the while waiting for the moment to strike. He blended so completely into the fabric of ordinary life that no suspicion clung to him. And then, when the hour was right, he drew his dagger and rewrote history in a heartbeat. The crusaders, too, felt the sting of these tactics. Lords of castles, leaders of armies, men who believed their fortresses made them untouchable, fell suddenly to daggers at feasts or in their own halls. Chroniclers, bewildered, painted the assassins as demons, fanatics beyond comprehension. To European ears, no ordinary men could display such calm before death. Surely they must be bewitched. And so the myths of drugs and gardens spread, embroidered upon the terror already felt. But the truth was simpler. The assassins were not intoxicated by wine or hashish. They were intoxicated by certainty. Their discipline, their faith, their devotion turned them into instruments. Where armies required gold, these men required only conviction. Where armies needed supply chains, the assassins needed only patience. Where armies left behind burning fields, the assassins left behind a single corpse, and 1,000 whispers. Whispers more deadly than swords. For terror was their true currency. One assassination might tilt the balance of a war without a battle fought. One dagger might unravel an alliance, halt an invasion, or bring an empire to paralysis. Fear magnified every strike, making the Brotherhood appear larger than it was, stretching its shadow across Persia and Syria, across Crusader kingdoms and Seljuk palaces. The assassins did not need to be everywhere. They only needed rulers to believe they were. And rulers did believe. Imagine the banquet hall, filled with torches and laughter, a sultan reclining on cushions, goblets raised. Yet beneath the laughter runs a thread of unease. Every servant pouring wine is eyed with suspicion. Every stranger in the corner might carry a blade. The sultan laughs, but the laughter rings hollow, for he knows that one dagger could silence him forever. Armies may guard his palace gates, but fear has already slipped past them, sitting now like a guest at his table. This was the power of the tactics of terror. It was not the number of lives taken, but the number of lives unsettled. It was not the strength of arms, but the strength of imagination. Hasan ibn Sabbah had discovered a new theater of war, one fought not in fields of blood but in the minds of men. And as decades passed, the legend of these tactics grew. Chroniclers wrote in tones of awe and dread, kings cursed the old man of the mountain, and peasants whispered of shadowy figures moving among them. The assassins had achieved what armies could not. They had made themselves unforgettable. From Alamut, Hasan watched. He rarely descended into the world, rarely left his mountain. But he did not need to. His disciples carried his will, his image, his terror into the very hearts of empires. And so the fortress endured, impregnable not only in stone but in fear. For every dagger that struck, 10 more appeared in the imagination of rulers. For every disciple who died, a dozen more whispered prayers in Alamut's courtyards, ready to take his place. And so the tactics of terror multiplied, feeding upon themselves, until the Brotherhood's reputation was larger than their numbers, larger even than their fortress. They had discovered the alchemy of fear. And soon, this alchemy would find its purest form in the daylight strike, the philosophy that assassination was not to be hidden in shadows, but unveiled in public, made into spectacle. Terror, sharpened, made into theater. From silence to daylight the daggers would gleam. Fear is sharpest not in the dark, but in the light. A murder in the night can be blamed on thieves, on chance, on the chaos that hides in shadows. But a murder in broad daylight, before the eyes of a crowd, carries a message that cannot be ignored. It is deliberate. It is spectacle. It is terror performed as theater. The assassins understood this with a clarity unmatched in their time. Their daggers were not the tools of hidden assassins, slipping unseen through windows in the dark. No, they were instruments of revelation, meant to strike where the world was brightest, so that all could see. Picture a busy marketplace in Persia. The sun beats down on the stalls, merchants cry their wares, spices fill the air. A governor, surrounded by guards, strolls through the press of people, confident in the shield of his soldiers. Then, in the blink of an eye, the press of bodies surges, and a young man steps forward. A flash of steel, a cry, and the governor falls, crimson staining the dust. The crowd gasps, panic ripples outward, guards rush to strike down the killer. But the killer does not flee. He stands there, his face calm, his dagger dripping. He welcomes the death that will follow, for in that moment he has accomplished his mission. The marketplace itself has become a stage, and the audience has seen the lesson. No power, no guard, no daylight can protect a man from the assassins. This was their philosophy of the daylight strike. Not hidden, but revealed. Not furtive, but public. Their killings were not only acts of violence, they were messages carved in flesh. Messages to rulers, you are never safe. Messages to the people, even the mighty can bleed. Messages to their own followers, your brothers do not fear death, nor should you. The daylight strike magnified the power of each killing. A secret murder could be denied, buried in rumor. But a death in the square, in the mosque, at a banquet, that could not be hidden. It became story, legend, propaganda carried on the lips of every witness. The assassins did not need to spread their own reputation. Their enemies did it for them. Consider again the assassination of Nizam al-Mulk, the great Seljuk vizier. He fell not in the secrecy of chambers, but in the open, stabbed by a man who posed as a wandering dervish. The vizier's death was not only the fall of a statesman, but the birth of a legend. Word raced across Persia, across empires. The assassins had struck, and they had struck at the very heart of power. From that day forward, every ruler in the Seljuk lands glanced over his shoulder. The crusaders, too, felt the spectacle. In the Levant, lords who strutted in their castles and marched with banners fell suddenly to daggers in their own halls, often before the eyes of their men. Some chroniclers tell of Conrad of Montferrat, newly elected king of Jerusalem, stabbed in the streets of Tyre in 1192. Two assassins, disguised as monks, approached him openly, bowed, and then struck. Conrad fell in full view of his attendants, his killers cut down immediately. But the strike was complete. The message was not only to the crusaders, it was to the world, that even kings could not escape the reach of the old man of the mountain. And this was the brilliance. The assassins did not need to survive their missions. They did not need to escape, to vanish into shadows. Their willingness to die made secrecy irrelevant. If a man is already prepared to fall beneath swords after his strike, then he need not flee. And if he does not flee, then he can strike in the open, in daylight, with maximum effect. In this, the assassins inverted the very logic of killing. Most murderers seek escape. The assassin sought display. His act was not a crime to be concealed but a sermon to be preached, with blood as ink and daylight as parchment. Witnesses became the true weapon. Each eye that saw the strike carried the terror onward, multiplying it 100-fold. A vizier's death in daylight was not only his end, it was a plague of fear carried by every tongue that repeated the tale. The daylight strike also reshaped power. Rulers who once walked confidently among their subjects began to shrink into paranoia. Guards multiplied, gates closed, fortresses became prisons as much as palaces. Kings grew afraid of banquets, governors of mosques, emirs of marketplaces. And in that fear lay the assassin's triumph. Rulers cut themselves off from the people they governed, weakening their authority. Suspicion poisoned trust. Every servant became suspect, every guard a potential dagger-bearer. But the daylight strike was not mere spectacle. It was also ritual. To the assassins themselves, to fall in the act was not defeat but victory. To shed one's blood in public, to make one's death an offering before the eyes of a crowd, was a form of liturgy. It transformed each assassin into both killer and martyr, remembered not only for the life he took but for the devotion he proved. And so the daylight strikes became as much about identity as about strategy. Each act reminded the world, the assassins were not thieves, not mercenaries, not nameless shadows. They were men who bore death calmly, who made their bodies into messages, who turned every marketplace and mosque into a pulpit for their creed. Of course, such tactics also invited awe and exaggeration. Chroniclers, terrified, told of assassins appearing as if from nowhere, striking, and then vanishing like smoke. In truth, they often died where they struck, but legend had already magnified them. To crusaders and kings, they became specters who could walk unharmed through guards, phantoms immune to fear. The reality, men trained in patience, disguised in plain sight, hardened by faith, was in some ways even more chilling. Stand with me in the square of a medieval city. The sun is high, Children chase each other through the dust, merchants cry their wares. A lord passes through, flanked by guards, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Suddenly, the crowd surges, a flash of steel glints, and in an instant the lord is gone, his blood soaking the earth, his guards shouting in confusion, the assassin already cut down. The marketplace is never the same again. Nor is the city. Nor is the kingdom. Such was the daylight strike, simple, devastating, unforgettable. From these acts, the very word assassin would one day be born, a word that came to mean not only killers, but killers who strike with meaning, with spectacle, with terror as their true weapon. And as the myths of gardens and drugs swirled, as chroniclers embroidered tales of sorcery and fanaticism, the core truth remained: the assassins chose daylight because fear multiplies in the open. Their daggers gleamed not for secrecy, but for story. And story, once unleashed, is harder to kill than any man. And so we move forward deeper still, into the power of words themselves. For even as daggers carved terror into daylight, names and legends carried that terror across the world. The word itself, assassin, was forged here, in the mingling of myth and blood. When a vizier fell in the mosque, when a crusader lord was struck down in the street, what truly spread across empires was not the corpse but the story. And with each story came a word, a label, a name whispered first in fear, then in awe, then in legend: assassin. But where did that word come from? Who first spoke it? And how did it grow so vast that centuries later, long after Alamut had fallen, it still clings to us, heavy with mystery and dread? The origins are tangled, like roots beneath the soil. Enemies of the Nizaris gave them many names, few of them kind. In Arabic, they were often called Hashishiyya, a term of derision, perhaps meaning hashish eaters, perhaps outcasts, or rabble. Sunni chroniclers, contemptuous of the Nizari sect, hurled the name as insult. It implied mindlessness, intoxication, men who dulled their senses with drugs and were led like cattle by Hasan ibn Sabbah. To call them Hashishiyya was to strip them of dignity, to reduce their devotion to hallucination. But words have strange lives. From Hashishiyya came distortions, Hashishin, Assassini, Assassini, until in the tongues of crusaders it became Assassini, Assassinus. By the time it reached Europe, the word had been sharpened into assassin. And from there, it leapt into every language, carrying with it the aura of fear born in those daylight strikes. But let us pause. Was it true? Did the assassins truly eat hashish to dull their fear, as chroniclers claimed? Did Hasan ibn Sabbah drug his disciples, lead them into paradise gardens, and convince them that obedience would return them there? Here we step into the haze of myth. The stories were written not by the assassins themselves, whose voices survive only faintly, but by their enemies. Sunni chroniclers eager to brand them heretics. Crusaders bewildered by their calm before death. European travelers eager to return with tales of the exotic and strange. To such men, the idea that faith alone could give courage was unthinkable. There had to be trickery, sorcery, intoxication. And so the legend of hashish was born. Marco Polo, centuries after Hassan's death, embroidered it further. He claimed the old man of the mountain kept secret gardens of paradise, filled with rivers of milk and honey, maidens more beautiful than any in the world. Young men, drugged with hashish, were carried into these gardens and awoke to a heaven made flesh. Then, after days of bliss, they were cast out, told it had been but a glimpse, and only by dying in Hassan's service could they return forever. It was a story too marvelous to resist, and so it spread like wildfire through Europe. Yet historians now doubt it. No record from the Nizaris themselves speaks of such gardens. No evidence shows hashish used in ritual. What seems far more likely is that the term Hashishiyya was a slur, twisted into legend by those who could not comprehend such fearless obedience. For is it not easier to believe in sorcery than in conviction? Easier to imagine paradise gardens than to admit that men will walk calmly into death for faith. Still, the myth proved enduring. The word assassin carried with it not only the act of killing, but the aura of mystery, intoxication, fanatic devotion. By the time it reached medieval Europe, it was no longer merely a name for one sect in the mountains of Persia. It had become a symbol of secret killers, of daggers in the dark, or in the daylight, and of men who answered not to kings but to shadows. And so the word lived on, detached from its roots, gathering new meanings. In the East, to call someone Hashashir remained an insult, a dismissal of their reason. In the West, to call someone an assassin was to cloak them in dread and intrigue. Chroniclers wrote of the assassins as if they were demons. Crusader lords carried home stories of their fearlessness. Poets wove their name into tales of secret brotherhoods. The irony is sharp. Hasan ibn Sabbah, who demanded discipline, austerity, and truth, became remembered in the West not as a master of conviction, but as a sorcerer who drugged his men into obedience. The reality was severe and sober. The legend was lush and intoxicating. Which, then, is more powerful, the truth or the word? Think of it, even today, centuries after Alamut's fall, the word assassin still means killer, secret murderer, dagger in the dark. Empires that crushed Alamut have crumbled into dust, but the word has survived. Words, once sharpened, can outlive stone. And in that lies a kind of poetic justice. The assassins themselves used fear as weapon, turning each strike into theater, each death into message. Their enemies, in trying to slander them, gave them a name that would carry their legend into eternity. The insult became immortality. Stand with me for a moment on a road through medieval Syria. A caravan passes, merchants whispering. A knight rides by, eyes scanning the hills. Someone speaks the name in hushed tones, assassin. The knight stiffens, the merchants glance about nervously. Perhaps there is no killer in sight. Perhaps there never was. And yet the word alone is enough to conjure shadows, to make hearts quicken, to thicken the air with fear. Such was the power of a name. From this word, Europe would spin endless tales. From this word, modern languages would inherit a symbol of secrecy and murder. From this word, the Brotherhood of Alamut would achieve the immortality Hasan ibn Sabbah himself never sought, but always commanded, to be remembered, to be whispered, to be feared. And so the daylight strikes fade into echo, but the echo becomes word, and the word becomes legend, and legend becomes history. But history did not stop at Alamut's walls. As the word spread westward, so too did rumors that shook Europe. Crusader lords returned home speaking of men who feared nothing, who struck without warning, who laughed at death. Chroniclers embroidered the tales until the assassins were less men than myth, their shadows reaching all the way into European courts. And so, with the word now etched into memory, let us step further into its consequences, the rumors that shook Europe, and how the name of the assassins spread like wildfire through lands that had never seen Alamut. Rumors travel faster than armies. It was not the Seljuk viziers or Persian governors who first carried tales of the assassins into Europe, but the crusaders. These men, hardened knights from France, England, the Rhineland, arrived in the Holy Land expecting to meet Saracen armies in open battle, swords clashing, banners flying. And yes, they did meet them. But they also met something stranger, something they had no word for, men who did not march to war, but who struck like lightning at leaders, and then smiled as death closed in around them. To the Crusaders, these men were incomprehensible. They had fought Turks, Arabs, Egyptians, even Byzantines, but always in war, in the known language of armies. The assassins belonged to no such language. They killed not for plunder, nor for territory, but with surgical precision. Their victims were often powerful men, emirs, viziers, lords. And most unsettling of all, the killers seemed unafraid of dying. Imagine the shock of a Frankish knight who sees an emir struck down in his own court, not by enemy soldiers, but by a lone youth who calmly accepts capture, torture, execution. No flight, no plea, no attempt at escape. Just a smile, perhaps, or a whispered prayer. Such defiance of fear seemed supernatural. The crusaders, unable to explain it, dressed it in myth. And so the tales began. They spoke of the assassins as a hidden brotherhood, ruled by a single master high in the mountains. They whispered of gardens of paradise, of young men drugged into visions of heaven, taught that obedience to their master would guarantee eternal bliss. They repeated the name they had heard, Hashishia, twisted into Assassini. They embroidered details with each telling, until the old man of the mountain became a phantom who could reach across deserts and seas to strike at will. The crusader states themselves were not untouched. Rulers in the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem quickly learned that the assassins were a force to be reckoned with. Some sought alliances with them, others feared their daggers. It is said that Baldwin II of Jerusalem once rumors travel faster than armies. It was not the Seljuk viziers or Persian governors who first carried tales of the assassins into Europe, but the crusaders. These men, hardened knights from France, England, the Rhineland, arrived in the Holy Land expecting to meet Saracen armies in open battle, swords clashing, banners flying. And yes, they did meet them. But they also met something stranger, something they had no word for, men who did not march to war, but who struck like lightning at leaders, and then smiled as death closed in around them. To the crusaders, these men were incomprehensible. They had fought Turks, Arabs, Egyptians, even Byzantines, but always in war, in the known language of armies. The assassins belonged to no such language. They killed not for plunder, nor for territory, but with surgical precision. Their victims were often powerful men, emirs, viziers, lords. And most unsettling of all, the killers seemed unafraid of dying. Imagine the shock of a Frankish knight who sees an emir struck down in his own court, not by enemy soldiers, but by a lone youth who calmly accepts capture, torture, execution. No flight, no plea, no attempt at escape. Just a smile, perhaps, or a whispered prayer. Such defiance of fear seemed supernatural. The crusaders, unable to explain it, dressed it in myth. And so the tales began. They spoke of the assassins as a hidden brotherhood, ruled by a single master high in the mountains. They whispered of gardens of paradise, of young men drugged into visions of heaven, taught that obedience to their master would guarantee eternal bliss. They repeated the name they had heard, Hashishia, twisted into Assassini. They embroidered details with each telling, until the old man of the mountain became a phantom who could reach across deserts and seas to strike at will. The crusader states themselves were not untouched. Rulers in the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem quickly learned that the assassins were a force to be reckoned with. Some sought alliances with them, others feared their daggers. It is said that Baldwin II of Jerusalem once received envoys from the assassins, and that Richard the Lionheart himself may have parleyed with them during his campaigns. Even when not allied, the crusaders respected their power, or, more accurately, feared it. But the rumors were always more powerful than the reality. By the time these stories reached Europe, carried by letters, pilgrim tales, and returning knights, they had swelled into legend. Chroniclers in France and England wrote of the assassins as fanatics without equal, who would leap to their deaths at the command of their master. Some claimed the old man of the mountain could make men believe they had seen heaven itself. Others swore his disciples could walk unharmed through armies, protected by sorcery. To a medieval European audience, these tales struck deep. Here was an enemy stranger than Saracens, more uncanny than Turks. An enemy not bound by the ordinary fears of men. In an age where faith and fear mingled daily, the idea of men who embraced death willingly was terrifying. The old man of the mountain became a figure of fascination. Chroniclers like William of Tyre and Jacques de Vitry wrote of him with awe and dread. By the 13th century, The stories had reached such popularity that even those who had never set foot in the Holy Land spoke of the assassins as if they were a plague upon the world. Marco Polo, in his later travels, sealed the myth by retelling, and embellishing, the tale of the Paradise Garden. It is important to see how the rumors functioned. They were not idle gossip. They reshaped how Europeans imagined the East. The Crusader kingdoms were not only fighting Saracen armies, they were also sharing borders with a shadowy sect whose daggers reached where armies could not. The assassins became a symbol of the unknown, the exotic, the terrifying. In the medieval imagination, they were proof that the East was a place of marvels and horrors, where men lived and died by rules alien to Christendom. But rumors also served political ends. Kings who faced rebellion at home could use the threat of assassins as a rhetorical tool, painting their enemies as secret conspirators. Chroniclers could fill their manuscripts with tales of the sect to spice their histories with dread. Even church preachers spoke of them in sermons, as examples of heresy and the dangers of false faith. The paradox is clear. The assassins themselves were a small sect, a mountain brotherhood, never numbering in the tens of thousands. Yet in Europe, they loomed larger than entire armies. Their true power, faith, discipline, daggers, was magnified 100-fold by the rumors that clothed them in myth. They were not just killers. Rumor magnified the Brotherhood. But rumor alone cannot endure without bone and blood. And so the assassins chose their victims carefully. They were not indiscriminate killers. Their daggers did not scatter randomly like arrows in a field. Each strike was a sentence, chosen with deliberation, carved into the fabric of politics. Their philosophy was clear: kill one man to save 10,000 battles. Why bleed armies dry when you can silence the general? Why burn fields when you can still the hand that orders them? Hasan ibn Sabbah had no illusions of conquest by force. His people were too few, his fortress too narrow. But a dagger in the right heart could change the direction of history itself. The first great example was Nizam al-Mulk, vizier of the Seljuks, slain in 1092. He was no ordinary man. He was the architect of Seljuk power, the mind that held the empire together. When he fell to the blade of a disguised assassin, some say as he was carried in a litter, others as he prayed, the empire he had shaped staggered. Within months, the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah was dead as well, perhaps poisoned. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. The Seljuk realm, once a vast machine, fractured into rival states. And at the heart of that unraveling, the hand of Hasan ibn Sabbah could be glimpsed. One dagger had done what armies could not. But the assassins did not strike only at Muslim rulers. The Crusader lords soon felt the sting. In 1192, Conrad of Montferrat, newly elected king of Jerusalem, walked the streets of Tyre. Two men approached him. Chroniclers say they were disguised as monks, others that they carried letters of trust. Conrad welcomed them, unguarded. Then, in an instant, their daggers flashed. The king, to be staggered, collapsed, bled into the stones. His killers were cut down at once, but the strike had been made. A throne was left empty. The kingdom of Jerusalem, already fragile, was thrown into chaos. Who ordered the death of Conrad? Even now, the question lingers. Some claimed Richard the Lionheart himself had conspired with the assassins, eager to rid himself of a rival claimant. Others whispered Saladin's name, though his conduct suggested otherwise. Perhaps it was purely the will of the old man of the mountain, seeing an opportunity to play rivals against one another. Whoever had given the command, the effect was undeniable. With one killing, the fragile politics of the Holy Land shifted, and the legend of the assassins deepened in European minds. These were the great spectacles, remembered in chronicles. But many other names fell beneath assassin blades, names that mattered deeply in their own time, even if less known to us now. Seljuk governors who taxed the people too heavily. Emirs who threatened Nizari's survival. rival Shura leaders who challenged Hasan's authority. Each killing was calculated not for vengeance, but for utility. A blade was wasted if it struck in anger. A blade was sacred if it struck at the right throat. And what was the effect of this precision? A ruler who feared the assassins did not march so boldly. A general who knew his guards could not shield him looked twice before ordering a campaign. An emir who dreamed of crushing Alamut might wake to find a dagger at his pillow, not killing him, but warning him. Many submitted to Nizari demands without bloodshed at all, preferring uneasy truce to certain peril. This was the unseen consequence. The Brotherhood's blades killed far fewer men than their enemies feared. The myth made them omnipresent. The reality was surgical. The shadow of the dagger fell across far more necks than the dagger itself. Yet still, the actual killings mattered. They sent ripples outward, ripples that touched empires. In Syria, the assassins struck crusader lords as well as Muslim emirs. Raymond II of Tripoli was stabbed outside the gates of his city. Count after count, emir after emir, fell with little warning. Each death was both punishment and prophecy. Punishment for those who opposed them, prophecy for those who saw what would come if they defied the old man's will. Even Saladin himself, the great unifier, the Sultan whose name still rings through history, was not beyond their reach. Twice he escaped assassin blades. Once, attackers crept into his very tent at night, slashing wildly before they would cut down. Another time, during a campaign, assassins struck at his guard, wounding those close to him. Saladin survived, but the message was clear: even the greatest sultan of his age was vulnerable. Even he trembled at the thought of the dagger. And what of the assassins themselves? They knew their deaths were certain. They did not flee, did not disguise themselves afterward. Their survival was never the point. Their deaths were woven into the strike itself, part of the theater. And so each victim was not merely killed, he was sacrificed upon an altar of fear, with the assassin's own life as the offering. Stand with me, for a moment, at the gate of a Syrian castle. A count rides out with his retinue, the people cheering. Suddenly, from the crowd, two figures lunge, daggers flashing. The count falls, his men cry out, the assassins are cut down in a storm of blades. The dust settles. The body of the Lord is carried away. And in the silence that follows, everyone knows, the assassins were here. And they can be here again. That was the true target, not only the man who died, but the world that watched. And so the list of victims grew. Viziers, governors, lords, emirs, even caliphs marked for death. Some struck, some merely threatened. Each one chosen to tilt the balance of power. The Brotherhood did not wage war. They rewrote politics one throat at a time. This was their genius, to use the dagger not only as a weapon of murder, but as a tool of diplomacy. To kill was sometimes necessary. To frighten was often enough. Between the two, the assassins survived surrounded by empires that outnumbered them 100-fold. And what remains most astonishing is this: they succeeded. For nearly 2 centuries, while Seljuks rose and fell, while crusaders marched and faltered, while Saladin built an empire and Mongols began their thunder, the assassins endured. Their fortress stood. Their name echoed. Their enemies trembled. The targets of their blades are long buried. But their names, Nizam al-Mulk, Conrad of Montferrat, Raymond of Tripoli, remind us that history itself was reshaped by daggers wielded by men who did not expect to live a moment beyond their strike. This is the paradox of the Brotherhood. Their lives were brief, their deaths certain, yet their impact immense. By choosing their targets with precision, they extended their reach far beyond their numbers, becoming players in the grand game of empires. And in their choice of targets lay something even deeper, a reflection of their faith. For to the assassins, these were not mere killings. They were acts of devotion, sacrifices of both victim and killer to a cause greater than either. Each strike was more than politics. It was liturgy carved in steel. Faith as shield, faith as weapon. That was the creed of Alamut. And so, as we move forward, we must step deeper into the heart of the Brotherhood spirit, into the minds of the men who welcomed death, who carried daggers without fear, who became the very embodiment of sacrifice. The next stage of our journey takes us into the souls of these men, into their defiance of death itself, into the warriors without fear. What kind of man walks calmly towards certain death? What kind of young disciple steps forward in a crowded square, dagger hidden beneath his cloak, knowing full well that once it is drawn, his life is already forfeit? Not tomorrow, not in old age, but now, in the next breath? The assassins were such men, warriors without fear. It was not that they felt no fear at all. Fear is stitched into the fabric of humanity. The difference was that they learned to unweave it, to cut it away, until what remained was not recklessness but serenity. To witness them was to glimpse something unsettling, a man who knew he would die, yet walked smiling toward the act. How was this possible? The answer lies in the fortress of Alamut, in its discipline, its training, its faith. From youth, disciples were shaped to see death not as enemy but as companion. Every lesson, every prayer, every ritual reinforced this. They were told that to die in obedience was to ascend, that the moment of the blade was not an end, but a passage, that fear of death was weakness, and weakness had no place in Alamut. And so they trained. Hours of prayer, hours of silence, hours of patience. They learned to wait without stirring, to strike without hesitation, to die without flinching. In their daily rhythm, death was not hidden, it was ever present, a constant horizon toward which all walked. Imagine a young recruit, sitting in the stone courtyard of Alamut, the mountain winds whipping at his cloak. A teacher places a dagger in his hand. Not a sword, not a spear, but a blade meant for closeness. This, the teacher says, is not for war. It is for sacrifice. Perhaps theirs. Perhaps yours. Be ready for both. The boy nods. Already he understands. This discipline produced men who could do what armies could not. Armies broke in battle when death seemed near. But the assassins walked into death as though into prayer. They had unlearned the instinct of survival. Their survival was in the mission, not in their flesh. And so they stood firm when others would have fled. This unnerved their enemies more than any dagger. Take the example of Conrad of Montferrat. His assassins did not flee after their strike. They knew the mob would cut them down. And yet they remained calm, their daggers still in hand, their eyes unflinching. Chroniclers wrote that they accepted their fate with smiles. To the watching crowds, this was as terrifying as the killing itself. What kind of men embraced their own destruction? What force could command such loyalty? Or consider the story, perhaps true, perhaps myth, of Hasan ibn Sabbah demonstrating his power to end boys. He called his disciples to a high balcony. At a word, 2 of them leapt into the abyss, dashing themselves to death upon the rocks below. The envoys, horrified, trembled. Hasan turned to them and said, "I have 70,000 men like these." Whether he did or not hardly mattered. The point was made: if his followers feared nothing, then who could stand against him? Such tales spread like wildfire. And though embellished, they were rooted in something real. The assassins did not need 70,000 men. A handful was enough, if each was willing to die. Fearlessness was not only a tactic, it was spectacle. The assassin's calm in the face of death was part of the theater, part of the message. A man who kills and then flees is a murderer. A man who kills and then welcomes death is a symbol. The crusaders struggled to comprehend it. To them, such devotion could only be explained by sorcery, by drugs, by enchantment. They invented tales of hashish and gardens to account for it. For how else could men embrace death so easily? To them, it seemed inhuman. And yet, in truth, it was the most human of choices, to give one's life for belief. It was this defiance of death that magnified every strike. Rulers could hire more guards, build higher walls, bar their doors tighter. But none of it mattered. For how do you defend against a man who has already accepted his own death? You may kill him, but not before he has killed you. And so rulers trembled. For once fear of death is removed, no power can intimidate, no punishment can deter. The assassins had turned their weakness, their small numbers, their inability to raise armies, into unmatched strength. They became an army of martyrs, each dagger backed not by the will to survive, but by the will to sacrifice. Consider Saladin. Twice he escaped their blades. And yet, after those attempts, he rode with heavier guard, avoided certain roads, watched his courtiers more closely. Even the great Sultan who faced crusader armies hesitated before the possibility of a single assassin. His campaigns were slowed, his confidence tempered. The warriors without fear had touched him without killing him, and that touch was enough. Or look again to Persia. Governors who heard of Nizam al-Mulk's fate grew cautious. Some avoided antagonizing the Nizaris. Others paid tribute. Still others hesitated before attacking Alamut, fearing their own fate would soon follow. The Brotherhood's survival lay not only in stone walls, but in the fearlessness of its disciples. That fearlessness echoed outward, corroding the resolve of their enemies. But fearlessness is not coldness. It was not born of apathy. The assassins did not go to death numb, nor indifferent. They went with purpose. Each man who raised his dagger believed he was part of something eternal, something vast. He believed his death mattered, that it was woven into the pattern of history. And so he walked to it willingly. Stand with me again in a crowded mosque. A young assassin steps forward, his dagger hidden. He kneels, waits, prays. When the moment comes, he rises, strikes, and is immediately seized. Blades cut him down. Blood stains the marble. He dies. And yet, in that death, he has achieved everything. The vizier lies dead beside him. The message is sent. The mission is complete. This is what it means to be a warrior without fear. To accept death not as failure, but as fulfillment. To see the dagger not only as a weapon, but as a sacrament. And so the assassins endured, not because of numbers, not because of wealth, but because of this singular power, men who did not fear death. It is here, in their defiance, that their legacy deepened. For centuries after, Europe would remember them not only as killers, but as fanatics who walked smiling into death. The myths of drugs and sorcery tried to explain it away, but the truth was simpler and more unsettling. The assassins had mastered their own mortality. And what of those who survived? For not all missions ended in certain death. Some assassins returned, slipping back into Alamut, into the shadows. They lived, trained others, prepared again. But even they lived as men already half in the grave, their lives borrowed, their deaths anticipated. This lent them a strange serenity, a calm that marked them out from other men. To their enemies, they seemed monstrous. To their brothers, they seemed holy. Theirs was a faith that turned fear into a weapon, and death into a tool. Warriors without fear, they became the most enduring symbol of Hasan ibn Sabbah's creed. But how did one become such a man? How was a boy transformed into an assassin willing to sacrifice his life with serenity? The answer lies in the hidden education of Alamut, in the slow shaping of mind and body, in the making of an assassin. The story of the assassins is often told from the outside, by enemies, by chroniclers, by odd travelers who saw only the blade's flash and the legend it left behind. But to truly understand their power, one must step inside the fortress, past the gates of Alamut, into the hidden courtyards where boys became disciples and disciples became warriors without fear. Here, in the cold air of the Persian mountains, the making of an assassin began not with steel, but with silence. Imagine a boy brought to Alamut. He may have been the son of a villager, given over by his parents, or perhaps an orphan, found and brought by missionaries who spread the Nizari creed through Persia and Syria. He is young, perhaps 10 or 12, wide-eyed, shivering as the mountain wind cuts through his thin cloak. Before him looms the fortress, its walls towering like cliffs, its banners snapping in the wind. He has heard whispers of this place, of daggers, of death, of paradise, but nothing prepares him for the life awaiting inside. The first lesson is silence. In Alamut, words are weighed carefully. A disciple learns quickly that every utterance is to be measured, that speech is not for chatter but for precision. Days might pass in quiet study, in the listening of sermons, in the stillness of meditation. Patience is carved into him like letters into stone. Then comes discipline. Hasan ibn Sabbah demanded it above all. No indulgence, no luxury, no wine, no softness. In this, Alamut was the opposite of the legends whispered by outsiders. There were no gardens of bliss for the young disciple, no rivers of honey, no maidens with soft hands. Instead there were stone floors, cold nights, long fasts, hard beds. Hasan himself lived with the same austerity. His rule was not one of indulgence but of relentless control. And so the boy learns that comfort is an enemy, that strength lies in endurance. But this was not cruelty. It was shaping. Each hunger pang, each shiver in the cold, each hour of waiting without complaint was a sharpening of the soul. The boy learns that suffering is not to be fled but embraced, not punishment but preparation. Alongside discipline comes faith. In the courtyards and chambers of Alamut, the boy hears the words of teachers who speak of the Nizari cause, of the rightful line of imams descended from Ali, of the corruption of the Seljuk viziers, of the tyranny of those who would oppress their people. He learns that his life is not his own, but belongs to something greater, to the Imam, to the Brotherhood, to God's unfolding design. Faith is not presented as abstract. It is embodied in the living example of Hasan ibn Sabbah. The boy hears tales of his founder, of his brilliance, his sacrifice, his refusal to compromise even when tempted with riches. Hasan is more than leader, he is model, prophet, mirror of the creed. And though Hasan himself seldom appears before the young disciples, his presence is everywhere, like the mountain wind, unseen, but undeniable. Training is not all spiritual. Slowly, the boy learns the craft of patience in other forms. He is taught to move unnoticed through crowds, to dress as a servant, a scholar, a soldier. He learns languages, dialects, the habits of other peoples. Espionage is part of his schooling, for to strike well, he must first live well among his targets, unseen. Then, when he is ready, comes the dagger. It is not given lightly. To hold it is not to gain power, but to take a vow. A dagger is no mere weapon, it is a burden, a trust, a reminder that its edge cuts both ways. To strike with it is to die with it, whether in body or in spirit. The boy, now young man, learns to conceal it, to draw it swiftly, to use it in close quarters where hesitation means death. He learns to kill with precision, one strike, one life, no waste. And yet, killing is not the focus. Patience remains the greater skill. Some disciples will spend years, even decades, in waiting, living as scribes, servants, merchants in distant cities, never once drawing their daggers until the order comes. This is perhaps the hardest lesson of all, to be ready for death, yet to wait endlessly before embracing it. Through these years, the young man is tested again and again. Not by battles, but by temptations. Can he resist comfort? Can he remain silent when provoked? Can he keep his secret hidden even when suspicion falls upon him? Can he wait, and wait, and wait, without breaking? Many could not. But those who did became legends. And what of the paradise gardens? The rumors that spread through Europe, of drugged initiates shown visions of heaven? If such things were ever staged, they were rare and theatrical. The true paradise of Alamut was not in gardens but in certainty. A disciple needed no drug to face death calmly. His intoxication was conviction itself. There are stories of initiates who, once prepared, were given impossible tests. One tale, perhaps myth, perhaps truth, tells of a disciple ordered to plunge his dagger into his own chest, only to have the master halt him at the final moment. The test was not to kill himself, but to prove his willingness. Such stories, true or not, reveal the essence of training, to strip away hesitation, to make obedience second nature. The making of an assassin was, in truth, the making of a man without self. His identity was fused with the Brotherhood. His death was not his own but already promised. His life was a tool, his body an instrument. And yet, and this must not be forgotten, he was still human. He laughed with his brothers in the courtyards. He felt hunger, longing, fatigue. He remembered the faces of his family left behind in distant valleys. He might even dream of survival, of a life after. But all of this was folded into his training, transmuted into something higher. The assassin's humanity was not erased, but harnessed. His love, his longing, his fear, all were bent into a single line pointing toward the strike. Consider again Conrad of Montferrat's killers. They lived in Tyre for months before the act, disguised as holy men, moving among the people, waiting. They ate with them, prayed with them, laughed with them. Then, when the order came, they struck without hesitation. They died, but their deaths were not surprises. They had been preparing for them since the day they first walked through the gates of Alamut as boys. That is the hidden truth. An assassination was not a sudden act, but the culmination of a lifetime. The dagger's flash was the final note of a long symphony, composed in silence, practiced in patience, sharpened by faith. And when the assassin fell, cut down by guards or mob, his brothers at Alamut did not mourn him as we mourn. His death was victory. His sacrifice was triumph. His name, whispered in the halls, was not lament but inspiration. Another boy, hearing it, would lift his head higher, hold his dagger tighter, knowing one day it might be his turn. This cycle, training, waiting, striking, dying, inspiring, was the rhythm of Alamut. It was how a fortress that could never raise great armies nonetheless became feared by emperors and kings. For every boy trained in silence, another dagger waited in the shadows of history. The making of an assassin, then, was the making of a legend. Each disciple, no matter how obscure, carried within him the potential to alter empires. Each boy who endured the cold of Alamut's courtyards might one day stand in a palace, in a marketplace, in a tent, and with a single strike shift the balance of history. And so the fortress endured, its stones echoing not with armies but with whispers, with prayers, with the steady breath of boys becoming men, men becoming daggers, daggers becoming symbols. But symbols do not go unchallenged. And though the assassins could strike rulers, could terrify empires, they could not remain untouched forever. Other powers grew. Other swords rose. And one day, the old man's disciples would meet an enemy who did not tremble at their daggers, an enemy who came not with rumor but with fire and thunder. Saladin himself had already tested them. But the true storm was yet to come. Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was not a man easily shaken. Born in Tikrit, raised in the turbulence of Syria and Egypt, he rose to power not through birthright but through brilliance. He was a commander of men, a statesman of vision, a leader who carried himself with both steel and mercy. To his allies he was the savior of Islam, to his enemies, the scourge of Christendom. And yet, even he, the man who would reclaim Jerusalem, who would humble kings and face down crusaders at Hattin, could not ignore the daggers of the assassins. The tension between Saladin and the Nizari Ismailis began not with blood but with ambition. Saladin's rise threatened every faction in the Near East, for he was not content to command Egypt alone. His aim was unity, to draw together fractured Muslim lands into one great force capable of standing against the Crusaders. To achieve this, He needed submission from rival emirs, governors, and sections. But the assassins were not a people to bend. They held their mountain strongholds fiercely. Their allegiance owed not to any sultan but to their own imam. To Saladin, this independence was a challenge, perhaps even a threat to his grand vision of unity. To the assassins, Saladin was simply another ruler who might seek to crush them beneath his armies. And so their paths converged, not in alliance but in blood. The first attempt came during Saladin's campaigns in Syria in the 1170s. He had marched against Aleppo, seeking to draw northern Syria into his orbit. But among the tangled alliances of the region, the assassins found reasons to resist. To them, Saladin was a danger, a man whose growing power threatened their very survival. And so they struck. One night, as Saladin camped with his army, assassins crept into his tent. Imagine the scene: the dark canvas of the Sultan's pavilion, the flicker of oil lamps, guards weary from long campaigning. And then, shadows slipping through, daggers flashing. Saladin awoke to chaos. His guards fought desperately. Chroniclers say the assassins slashed wildly, seeking the Sultan's heart. Some sources claim Saladin himself fought them off with his sword, others that his bodyguards bore the brunt of the attack. By the time the tent was secured, the assassins lay dead, but so too did some of Saladin's closest men. The attempt had failed. But the message had been delivered. If even Saladin could be reached in the heart of his own camp, then what fortress, what throne, what palace was safe? Yet Saladin did not turn back. If anything, his resolve hardened. He tightened his guard, yes, sleeping henceforth in towers, not tents, wary of shadows, but he did not bow to Alamut. Instead, he prepared for another campaign, determined to bring the assassins to heel. The second attempt came soon after, in 1176, during his siege of the fortress of Masyaf in Syria, one of the key Nizari strongholds. Saladin's armies surrounded the mountain citadel, confident of its fall. The assassins, besieged but unbroken, prepared their response. One night, as Saladin rested in his tent, he awoke to find something chilling. On his pillow lay a dagger, and with it, a note warning him to abandon the siege. His guards swore that none had passed, that the tent had been secured. And yet the dagger was there, gleaming in the lamplight, silent as death. Whether this tale is literal truth or embroidered legend, its meaning was clear: the assassins could reach him at will. No wall, no guard, no camp could shield him. His life was a thread in their hands, ready to be cut. Saladin, pragmatic as ever, took the lesson to heart. He lifted the siege of Masyaf and withdrew. It was not defeat in battle that forced him, but the invisible weight of the dagger on his pillow. For what good was conquest if even his own bed was not safe? This moment became one of the most famous in assassin lore. To their enemies, it proved their reach. To their followers, it showed divine protection, that even the mightiest sultan could be cowed without a single drop of blood. To Saladin himself, it was likely a sharp reminder that survival often demands compromise. Yet his relationship with the assassins did not remain only hostile. In the shifting politics of the Crusades, enemies became allies, rivals became partners. Saladin, ever pragmatic, at times sought to negotiate with the Nizaris. Better to have them neutral, or even aligned, than to waste endless resources in mountain wars. After all, the Crusaders remained the greater threat. And here is where the genius of the assassins becomes clear. They did not defeat Saladin on the battlefield, they could not. But they did not need to. Their daggers bought them leverage. Their strikes at his life, their reputation for fearlessness, made Saladin think twice, bargain more carefully, measure his steps. A sect numbering in the thousands forced the greatest sultan of his age to adjust his plans. The consequences rippled outward. When Saladin finally marched against the Crusaders, his attention was not consumed by endless wars against the Nizaris. He had chosen, wisely, to balance fear with diplomacy. In this, the assassins proved again the strength of their strategy: to survive not by conquering, but by becoming indispensable, by wielding terror as shield and sword. And yet, for all Saladin's pragmatism, the encounters left their mark. Chroniclers note his caution, his increased reliance on guards, his avoidance of unnecessary risks. The lion of Islam still roared, but he had felt the shadow of the dagger, and it had tempered him. Let us pause and reflect on this. The assassins never fielded armies against Saladin. They never won a battle in open war. And yet their story is interwoven with his, as if two destinies circled one another: the Sultan who sought to unify the Muslim world, and the Brotherhood who sought only to endure. Neither destroyed the other. Both, in their way, succeeded. Saladin reclaimed Jerusalem, the assassins preserved Alamut. But their clash remains a reminder that history is not written by armies alone. Sometimes it is shaped by whispers in the night, by daggers on pillows, by men who are unafraid to die. And so, when we think of Saladin, the conqueror, the knight, the man whose mercy astonished his crusader foes, we must also remember the shadows that haunted him, the moments when even he, the greatest of his age, was forced to reckon with the silent power of Alamut. Yet if Saladin was formidable, there was a storm still greater on the horizon. For while he was a man of flesh and wisdom, another enemy was rising, not cautious, not merciful, but relentless as the tide. The Mongols, riders of the steppe, thunder of the east, would soon sweep down upon the mountains of Persia. And where Saladin had hesitated, they would not. The daggers of the assassins had struck sultans and kings. But would they avail against the storm of the Mongols? The Mongols did not come like other enemies. Seljuks had come with armies, yes, but armies that could be bribed, delayed, or destabilized with a dagger in the heart of a vizier. Crusaders had come with knights and banners, but their attention was divided, their politics fractured, their hearts divided between Jerusalem and home. Even Saladin, though mighty, could be swayed, could be forced to balance fear with pragmatism. But the Mongols, they were something else. From the steppes they rode like a storm, vast and unyielding. Their cavalry moved with a speed and discipline unknown to settled empires. They burned cities not as conquest, but as warning. They executed kings, toppled dynasties, and erased entire peoples who dared resist. Where others sought to rule, the Mongols sought to annihilate. And in time, their gaze fell upon Persia. The assassins, tucked into their mountain fortresses, had long believed in the strength of their stone walls and their sharpened reputation. They had survived centuries by making themselves untouchable, too costly to attack, too dangerous to ignore. Their castles were perched on heights almost impossible to besiege. Their reputation kept enemies cautious, unwilling to commit to endless war. But reputation meant nothing to the Mongols. For the Mongols knew no fear of daggers. They did not shudder at the thought of a lone assassin slipping into their tents. Their empire was not held together by a single vizier or sultan whose death might unravel it, but by the iron will of their khans and the relentless discipline of their hordes. The assassins had built their strategy upon the vulnerabilities of kings. But what happens when the enemy has no such vulnerability? It began in the early 13th century, as Mongol forces pressed into the Middle East. One by one, cities fell: Nishapur, Herat, Baghdad itself in 1258, its libraries burned, its caliph trampled beneath horses. The world trembled. At Alamut, the assassins watched and waited. They had faced great enemies before, and some hoped that diplomacy might again preserve them. Envoys were sent, tributes offered. Some even dreamed of an alliance, the assassins whispering into Mongol ears, guiding their blades toward the crusaders. But the Mongols were not so easily swayed. They tolerated submission, but not independence. And the assassins, with their proud fortresses and their centuries of defiance, were too independent to survive. The final reckoning came under Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis. charged with subduing Persia, he saw the assassins as both threat and nuisance. Their castles disrupted supply lines. Their reputation for assassination was intolerable to Mongol authority. And so he marched against them. The fall of the castles was not one swift blow, but a grinding collapse. One by one, the mountain strongholds were surrounded, their defenders isolated, their supplies cut off. The assassins, so adept at striking leaders, now faced an enemy immune to their greatest weapon. They sent assassins against Hulagu himself, but the Mongol discipline was unshaken. Guards were vigilant, security tight, punishments swift. No dagger could halt the tide of horses. At last, Alamut itself was besieged in 1256. Picture the scene, the fortress rising like a fawn from the mountains, its walls gleaming in the pale sun, its defenders watching the horizon. And then, a dust cloud, endless horsemen, siege engines dragged across the land, the Mongol banners snapping in the wind. The assassins had faced armies before, but never this. Siege engines hurled stones, towers pressed close, and the Mongols, masters of adaptation, learned quickly how to scale even the most inaccessible heights. Inside Alamut, desperation grew. Supplies dwindled. Hope withered. For once, the defenders knew that their fortress might not be enough. The dagger had met its match in fire and thunder. And so, at last, they surrendered. Alamut, the heart of the Brotherhood, the fortress that had stood as symbol and sanctuary for nearly 2 centuries, fell into Mongol hands. The conquerors showed little mercy. Libraries were burned. Treasures plundered. Some say the great library of Alamut, filled with centuries of collected knowledge, scientific, philosophical, theological, was cast into flames, its pages turned to ash. Others say Hulagu spared certain texts, curious of their contents. But the fortress as symbol was broken. The assassins themselves were slaughtered or scattered. Some fled into distant mountains. Others blended into villages, their identity hidden. The Brotherhood as it had been, proud, unyielding, feared by kings, was shattered. And yet, even in defeat, their legend endured. For though Alamut fell, the idea of the assassins could not be erased so easily. The Mongols burned stone and flesh, but rumor is fireproof. The tales of daggers, of fearless disciples, of the old man of the mountain, these survived, carried on the lips of survivors, spread by chroniclers, magnified by Europeans who had never seen Alamut but swore to its terrors. Thus the fall of the castles was not the end, but the transformation. The Brotherhood dispersed. Its power broken, but its memory sharpened into myth. Consider this irony: the Mongols, who destroyed so much, became unwitting midwives to the assassins' immortality. By destroying Alamut, they ensured it would never fade quietly. The ruins became legend, the fall became story, and the assassins, though scattered, became eternal shadows. And so we leave the mountains not in triumph but in smoke. The towers of Alamut stand broken, its libraries ash, its courtyards empty of the boys who once trained in silence. The daggers are gone, the disciples dispersed. But in the imagination of the world, the assassins live on. For a Brotherhood destroyed in body may yet endure in spirit. And from the ruins of Alamut, the legend spread further still, reshaped into story, woven into the memory of Europe and beyond. The castles had fallen, but the shadows remained. And it is into those shadows we must now step, to follow the Brotherhood dispersed, to see how even in exile, even in ruin, the name of the assassins echoed across centuries. The towers of Alamut were broken. The libraries, whether burned or looted, were silenced. The disciples who had walked its courtyards were slain, enslaved, or scattered into the hills. Hulagu Khan rode away, satisfied that the dagger of the assassins had been blunted at last. And yet, Alamut was not truly silent. From the rubble, whispers escaped. From the mountains, survivors descended. Across Persia and Syria, Men who once carried the dagger lived on, some hiding their identity, others still carrying blades in secret. The Mongols had broken the Brotherhood's body, but they had not killed its spirit. Consider the nature of dispersal. A fortress is vulnerable. It can be besieged, starved, taken. A brotherhood hidden in villages, disguised as merchants, dressed as farmers, is harder to erase. What the Mongols destroyed was visible power. What they left behind was something more elusive, a secret order now woven into the very fabric of society. And so, in the years after Alamut's fall, the assassins adapted. In Persia, they melted into obscurity. Some became scholars, hiding their lineage in libraries and madrasas. Others farmed quietly, passing their beliefs to children in whispered prayers at night. Their leaders, too, adapted. The imams, though forced into hiding, continued their line. The Nizari Ismaili community, stripped of castles, became a dispersed but enduring faith. What had once been a militant order became instead a community of quiet persistence, surviving by blending rather than by striking. In Syria, the story unfolded differently. There, the assassins still held a few castles even after Hulagu's onslaught, for the Mongol tide did not wash as thoroughly through the Levant as it did Persia. The Syrian branches, smaller but more flexible, endured by careful diplomacy. At times they leaned toward crusader powers, offering neutrality or even aid. At other times, they aligned with Muslim rulers. Survival was their creed now, not dominance. And so we see the shift, from assassins to survivors, from open blades to hidden hearts. But while their political strength waned, their legend only grew. For Europeans, returning from crusade with tales half true and half invented, the fall of Alamut was not the end but the beginning of myth. They carried back to their homeland stories of the old man of the mountain, of fearless disciples, of daggers on pillows, of gardens of paradise. They did not speak of Mongol sieges or burned libraries. Those details were too mundane. What they carried instead was the legend, and legend, unlike castles, cannot be toppled. It spread through chronicles, sermons, and travelers' tales. Monks in cloisters spoke of the assassins as demons in human form. Nobles whispered of them as a secret order lurking just beyond the horizon. Merchants embroidered the stories, each retelling more colorful than the last. The very name assassin became unmoored from its original root, redefined in European tongues as any secret killer, any hidden agent of death. Ironically, the Mongols, who had set out to erase the assassins, had ensured their immortality. By destroying their fortresses so completely, they created the perfect conditions for myth. Nothing remained but rumor. And rumor, free of stone and earth, takes flight. But we must not forget the human side. For behind the myth were men and women forced into exile, forced to adapt. Imagine a disciple of Alamut who survived the fall, now living in a village in the shadow of the ruins. By day he tills the soil, silent, anonymous. By night he remembers the chants of the fortress, the lessons of silence and patience. He tells his son not of daggers, but of faith, that the Imam still lives, hidden, waiting. His son grows, and passes it to his own son. Generations pass, and though the blade is no longer drawn, the spirit survives. Thus the Brotherhood became something new, no longer a militant order of feared assassins, but a dispersed faith community, surviving in quietude. Yet always, in their collective memory, Alamut lived on. In Syria, too, survival took curious forms. Crusaders and chroniclers note that even after the Mongol invasions, the Syrian assassins could still be hired, sometimes by Muslim rulers, sometimes by crusader lords themselves. Their services as dagger-bearers did not vanish overnight. But the great days of Hasan ibn Sabbah, when a single order from Alamut could tilt empires, were gone. Now they were one force among many, useful but no longer dominant. Still, the legend cast a long shadow. Consider this: even as the Nizaris adapted to survival, Their enemies continued to write of them as if they remained the same. Kings still warned each other of the assassins. Crusaders still spoke of their daggers as if they might appear at any moment. The fear outlived the reality. And in politics, fear is often more powerful than fact. This is how the Brotherhood survived, in faith, in memory, in rumor. They had been broken, but broken things sometimes scatter wider. And so the Nizaris endured into later centuries, evolving, changing, but never disappearing. Their imams resurfaced in later generations, guiding their followers through hidden lines of succession. Their faith, though tested by dispersal, grew roots in India, Central Asia, and beyond. Today, their descendants live still, not as assassins, but as a community known for resilience and adaptability. But for medieval Europe, and for much of the Islamic world too, what remained was not this quiet survival, but the myth of shadows. The word assassin detached itself from the community and became a symbol of secrecy, a symbol of fanatical devotion, a symbol of the knife in the dark. And so we arrive at a paradox. The assassins, as they truly lived, were destroyed by the Mongols. Yet the assassins, as they were imagined, survived forever. Their castles had fallen. Their disciples had scattered. But the story, the legend, the whisper of the old man of the mountain, that lived on in chronicles, in ballads, in frightened whispers across Europe. And so, when we step now into the next stage of our journey, we must step not into history alone, but into memory. Into the shadowy place where truth and legend blur, where the assassins ceased to be only men and became something larger. We must step into the legacy of shadows. When the Mongols pulled down the walls of Alamut, they believed they had erased a threat. What they did not realize was that they had given birth to a legend. The assassins, as men, could be hunted, killed, scattered. But the assassins, as idea, were untouchable. And so they slipped into Europe's imagination. The first threads were carried back by crusaders, weary knights, merchants, clerics, who had marched east and returned west with stories. These were not always faithful retellings. Men who had never seen Alamut spoke of it with authority, filling their gaps of knowledge with speculation. And in the dark halls of castles or the quiet cloisters of monasteries, listeners did not ask whether the details were true. They leaned closer, eyes wide, eager for tales of mystery and dread. One of the most enduring tales was that of the old man of the mountain. Europeans, bewildered by the assassins' obedience and their willingness to die, sought explanations. It was unthinkable, to their minds, that such loyalty could spring from faith alone. And so they imagined enchantment. Travelers like Marco Polo wrote of gardens of paradise, where young men were drugged with hashish and awakened among flowing rivers, jeweled fountains, and beautiful maidens. They were told they had glimpsed heaven itself, and that only obedience to the old man would return them there after death. Thus, when ordered to kill, they obeyed without hesitation, believing martyrdom would deliver them back into paradise. This story spread like wildfire across Europe. It explained the inexplicable, the calm with which assassins faced death. It turned them from disciplined disciples into drugged fanatics. It comforted Europeans with the thought that such devotion could not arise from conviction, only from trickery. Yet the story was not born in Europe alone. Muslim chroniclers too repeated similar tales, sometimes to discredit the Nizaris, sometimes to magnify their strangeness. In both East and West, the assassins became less a community and more a myth. But myth has power. The word itself, assassin, slipped into European tongues. It ceased to mean only the Nizaris and became instead a general word for any secret killer, any dagger in the night. Even today, centuries later, we use that word without thinking of Alamut, without thinking of Hasan ibn Sabbah, yet carrying unknowingly the echo of their name. In medieval Europe, the assassin became a symbol of dread. Chronicles spoke of them as unstoppable, of rulers who never slept soundly, of men who smiled at death as if it were a friend. To frightened kings, they became the embodiment of conspiracy, an enemy that could not be fought with armies, for it was not an army at all, but a whisper in the crowd, a blade in the marketplace. And so, even when the real assassins had been scattered and broken, their reputation outlived them. Monks in monasteries copied tales of them, adding flourishes. Troubadours sang of them, embellishing with each retelling. Nobles repeated their stories to guests as warnings of treachery. The assassin became a stock character in the European imagination, the shadow at the feast, the dagger in the dark, the fanatic who obeyed a distant master without question. Consider the irony. The Nizaris, once a living community of flesh and blood men and women, were transformed in European thought into symbols of everything hidden and sinister. Their faith, their philosophy, their daily lives were forgotten. What remained was the knife, the cloak, the name. And yet, this very distortion ensured their immortality. Had they been remembered truthfully, they might have been one sect among many, noted in histories but not feared in legend. Instead, by being exaggerated, demonized, and misunderstood, they became eternal. The legacy of shadows also stretched beyond Europe. In the Muslim world, too, the memory of the assassins endured, sometimes with hatred, sometimes with fascination. To Sunni chroniclers, they were heretics, dangerous splinterers of the faith, punished justly by Mongol fire. To others, they were a warning of what devotion without restraint could become. And among the Nizari themselves, memory was cherished not as dagger or terror, but as survival, the quiet knowledge that though their castles had fallen, their line endured. Thus 3 memories coexisted. In Europe, the assassin as killer, fanatic, drugged servant of the old man. In the wider Muslim world, the assassin as heretic, scourge, shadow. Among their own, the assassin as martyr, as disciplined guardian of the Imam. It is from the first 2 that the word entered global language. And it is from the third that a living community survived, transforming itself across centuries. So the legacy of shadows was double-edged. One side cut truth into legend. The other cut legend into survival. Let us stand for a moment in a European hall, a century after Alamut's fall. A chronicler bends over parchment, writing of distant lands. He has never seen Persia. He has never walked Syrian mountains. But he writes of the old man, of the gardens of paradise, of youths who smile as they plunge daggers into kings. His words, copied and recopied, will shape how generations think of the assassins. And so, in that moment, the Brotherhood survives, not in stone, not in blood, but in ink. From ink, the assassin passes into memory, and from memory into symbol. And symbols endure far longer than fortresses. The castles had fallen. The disciples had scattered. But the shadows they cast, shadows of secrecy, of fear, of unwavering loyalty, spread wider than any Mongol horde. The legend of the assassins would haunt Europe's imagination for centuries, shaping not only chronicles but even the very concept of the hidden hand in politics. The assassin became shorthand for the fear that somewhere, someone unseen, was plotting the downfall of kings. This is their true legacy, to outlive themselves, not as they were, but as the world believed them to be. And it is that belief, distorted, embellished, whispered, that carries us forward, into our final reflections on how the assassin endures not only in memory but even in modern speech, where their name still lingers, centuries after Alamut's stones turn to dust. And so, as we leave the legacy of shadows, we step finally into the last chapter of this journey, to see how the assassin's myth has survived into our own time, where the word still carries its ancient weight. Walk with me now, not through the smoke of battle or the dust of caravan trails, but through the quieter corridors of time, where echoes last longer than empires. When the Mongols tore down Alamut, they imagined the assassins finished. But as we have seen, what is finished in stone often continues in word. The assassins, scattered, diminished, and transformed, nonetheless became immortal in another way, as myth. And myth, once born, does not die easily. The name itself carried them forward. Assassin, a word that in its beginning was a slur, hurled by enemies, twisted from Hashashia into something darker. Yet this insult traveled further than any dagger, and in traveling it changed. In Europe, it ceased to mean one sect in one corner of the Muslim world. Instead, it became a common word, a name for all hidden killers, all plots, all daggers in the night. By the 14th century, chroniclers in France and England used it freely. To call someone an assassin was to accuse him of secret treachery, of murder committed not in open war but in cowardice and shadow. The old man of the mountain faded, but the shadow of his disciples clung to the word. And so, across centuries, the assassin survived in our speech. Every time the word is spoken, it carries an echo of Alamut, whether we know it or not. But the word did more than survive. It grew. In Europe's imagination, the assassin became the archetype of the secret society, a model that would inspire myths of Templars, Illuminati, Freemasons, all those imagined brotherhoods who rule from the shadows. Writers of romances and chronicles used the assassin as a warning, a reminder that not all threats wear armor or march with banners. Some threats slipped silently through doors at night. Later still, during the Renaissance, as Italy seethed with intrigue, princes and popes were said to fall to assassins. By then the connection to Alamut had grown faint, but the word's sting remained. Shakespeare's plays, Machiavelli's writings, all used the concept. An assassin was no longer a Nizari agent in Persia. He was a universal archetype, the killer who obeys no law but his master's, who strikes without warning, who vanishes into shadow. The assassins had outgrown themselves. They had become eternal. Meanwhile, in truth, the Nizari Ismaili community endured in quieter ways. No longer a militant brotherhood, they became instead a religious community, led by their imams through centuries of dispersal. They migrated, adapted, survived. In India, they became known as Khojas, blending into new cultural landscapes. Their line of imams continued unbroken, guiding followers with teachings of faith, resilience, and unity. Today, their descendants still live, known not as assassins but as Ismailis, led by the Aga Khan, a title carrying centuries of heritage. Here lies the paradox. The legend and the reality diverged so completely that most of the world forgot the living community even existed. The word assassin meant only shadow, terror, secrecy. Few knew it once pointed to real people, with families, with faith, with lives beyond daggers. And yet, even that divergence is part of their legacy. For the myth gave them immortality, while the community gave them continuity. Consider this: had the assassins remained only a sect of medieval Persia, they might have been forgotten, their castles reduced to footnotes in history. Instead, because they became legend, they are remembered still. A name known to millions, spoken in dozens of languages. Even stripped of context, the word carries weight. And so we come to our present. Think of how the word assassin appears today. In novels and films, it conjures shadows and secrecy. In games, it is tied to freedom, rebellion, the knife against tyranny. The legend has been reborn in countless forms, romanticized, dramatized, distorted, yet always magnetic. Even now, the assassin remains a figure who fascinates, who frightens, who intrigues. It is a testament to the power of story. A fortress may fall, but a story can outlast centuries. The assassins no longer climb palace walls, but their ghost haunts our imagination still. And if you close your eyes, you can almost hear them. The quiet steps in a stone corridor. The faint rustle of a robe. The breath drawn before the strike. That is their legacy. But let us also pause to reflect on the irony. For while the myth of the assassin thrives, the real descendants of Alamut's people live as something different, not shadows in the night, but a vibrant, visible community. They are no longer dagger bearers but educators, philanthropists, leaders in science and art. Their story has moved from fear to resilience, from blades to books. The Aga Khan Development Network, led by the modern Imam of the Ismailis, builds schools, hospitals, and cultural institutions worldwide. Where once they were feared as killers, now they are known, at least among those who look, as builders. So the word assassin, when spoken today, carries two ghosts, the ghost of the legend, and the ghost of the truth. The legend whispers of daggers in the dark. The truth whispers of survival, adaptation, and transformation. And perhaps that is fitting. For the assassins always lived in duality, fear and faith, dagger and prayer, myth and reality. Their afterlife continues that pattern. They live as shadows in language, and as flesh in their descendants. Both are true. Both endure. Thus we arrive at the end of our journey. From the birth of Hasan ibn Sabbah in Persia, to the rise of Alamut, to the training of disciples, to the clashes with Saladin, to the fall beneath Mongol fire, to the dispersal and survival of the Brotherhood, and finally, to the whisper of their name across centuries, into our own time. What remains is not only history, but memory. Not only memory, but symbol. And so, as the night deepens, imagine once more standing in a crowded bazaar, uncertain which man carries the blade meant for a king. Picture the fortress of Alamut, perched high above valleys, its walls silent but its reputation louder than any trumpet. Hear the echo of footsteps in a darkened corridor, the flicker of a dagger in lamplight, the prayer whispered by a disciple ready to die. They are gone. And yet they remain. For names outlive empires. And this name, assassin, has become eternal. And so, as the night settles, may these echoes of the past guide you gently into dreams, where shadows whisper and history breathes, and where the old man of the mountains still lingers, half real, half legend, always waiting in the dark.